Hello, good evening everybody, and welcome to another late night Purblind Gamer audiobook stream. Hey Seacross and Stock for Wooder and everyone else. And you guys should check out Seacross, who is streaming some weird PS1 game today, was it? I hope everybody's week is off to a good start. Mine was off to a halfway decent start until I got a call from my bank halfway through work today saying, "Did you buy groceries at a store in Maryland today?" And I said, "I have not been to Maryland in years." And they said, "Oh, okay, then your card's been compromised. We'll lock that for you and you can request a new one tomorrow." So that was fun. Yeah. Who knows when a new card will get here. Oh well. Not that I'm worried. More just an annoyance than anything else. How do they get a hold of your credit cards and then manage to use your credit cards in stores all the way across the nation while the credit card is still in your hand? I blame technology. I think that's fair. Also, possibly clairvoyance, but mostly technology. No card, Seacross. I'm sorry, just talking for Wooder. Credit card, or debit card, as the case may be. So, yeah. That was my day. Well, that and a bunch of nonsense at work, but not really nonsense. I got some good stuff done at work. Behind on other things. The usual. No, my fault for not enunciating. Geez, I should learn to pronounce things better, especially if I'm going to read books. But I hope everybody else's week is off to a better start. And as promised, I'm finally going to do another bonus stream where we continue reading The Circular Staircase. A long one, just for an hour. That'll probably get us through another 4 chapters. They're nice and short. When I read The King in Yellow, some of those stories were very good, but pretty long. Yeah, I'd been saying I was going to do this, and I got this lovely large print copy of the book. And this will make up for me missing Short Horror Saturday. And last week was a mess. I was going to say, this week's bound to be better. But thank you everybody who came out to my last couple of streams. We played, well, I guess both my last two streams were playing Blackwell Convergence. And yeah, we finished it last night and got to listen to all the audio bloopers and had a really fun time with it. And there's a red message. Oh yeah, no thanks, Stock for Wooder. I put that up mostly when I'm doing just chatting streams, like either for trigger. Oh shoot! Oh, my normal trigger warning is up. Yeah, no, the one in the lower left should be there. The one in the upper left should not. That's for Wednesday's stream. People would be very confused. Like, what sort of murder mystery from the 1900s are we reading exactly? Where do you get these things, Purblind Gamer? And I'm like, oh, you know, eBay. Yeah. But I hopefully won't be missing any more streams in the near future, and we'll be back to the normal schedule this week. And who knows how often I'll do the bonus streams reading this book. This is, I mean, it's large print, but it's, I don't know, 325 pages, something of that ilk. So it'll take a little while to get through. That's okay. I enjoyed the first 3 chapters we read. Yeah. the basic setup is that the story is told from the perspective of Rachel Innes, who is an older spinster, and raised her her orphaned niece and nephew, Halsey and Gertrude, who are now in their 20s, and they're all going back to this older house for a vacation one year. And the first couple nights, it seems there have been intruders. Rachel and the maid heard loud noises, and the maid found an unexpected cufflink button, and the elderly butler, I believe it was saying that there may be a ghost there. And when we ended last time, they heard more noises in the night, and Rachel came downstairs and found a dead body of a man she had never seen before. And that's where we'll pick up now. Oh yeah, and just to remind everybody, if I'm not responsive, that's because I'll respond to chat at the end of a chapter, and I get in the zone. I figure that's better to keep reading steadily, especially for everybody who watches the VOD, and if I ever rip the audio and put it onto LibriVox. The Circular Staircase by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Chapter 4. Where is Halsey? Gertrude gazed at the face in a kind of fascination. Then she put out her hands blindly, and I thought she was going to faint. "He has killed him," she muttered, almost inarticulately, and at that, because my nerves were going, I gave her a good shake. "What do you mean?" I said frantically. There was a depth of grief and conviction in her tone that was worse than anything she could have said. The shake braced her, anyhow, and she seemed to pull herself together. But not another word would she say. She stood gazing down at that gruesome figure on the floor, while Liddy, ashamed of her flight and afraid to come back alone, drove before her 3 terrified woman-servants into the drawing-room, which was as near as any of them would venture. Once in the drawing-room, Gertrude collapsed, and I went from one fainting spell into another. I had all I could do to keep Liddy from drowning her with cold water, and the maids huddled in a corner, as much use as so many sheep. In a short time, although it seemed hours, a car came rushing up, and Anne Watson, who had waited to dress, opened the door. 3 men from the Greenwood Club, in all kinds of costumes, hurried in. I recognized a Mr. Jarvis, but the others were strangers. "What's wrong?" the Jarvis man asked, and we made a strange picture, no doubt. "Nobody hurt, is there?" He was looking at Gertrude. "Worse than that, Mr. Jarvis," I said. "I think it is murder." At the word there was a commotion. The cook began to cry, and Mrs. Watson knocked over a chair. The men were visibly impressed. "Not any member of the family?" Mr. Jarvis asked, when he had got his breath. "No," I said, and motioning Liddy to look after Gertrude, I led the way with a lamp to the card-room door. One of the men gave an exclamation, and they all hurried across the room. Mr. Jarvis took the lamp from me, I remember that, and then, feeling myself getting dizzy and light-headed, I closed my eyes. When I opened them, their brief examination was over, and Mr. Jarvis was trying to put me in a chair. "You must get upstairs," he said firmly. "You and Miss Gertrude, too. This has been a terrible shock. In his own home, too." I stared at him without comprehension. "Who is it?" I asked with difficulty. There was a band drawn tight across my throat. "It is Arnold Armstrong," he said, looking at me oddly, "and he has been murdered in his family's house." After a minute, I gathered myself together, and Mr. Jarvis helped me into the living room. Liddy had got Gertrude upstairs, and the two strange men from the club stayed with the body. The reaction from the shock and strain was tremendous. I was collapsed, and then Mr. Jarvis asked me a question that brought back my wandering faculties. "Where is Halsey?" he asked. "Halsey!" Suddenly Gertrude's stricken face rose before me, the empty room upstairs. Where was Halsey?" "He was here, wasn't he?" Mr. Jarvis persisted. "He stopped at the club on his way over." "I don't know where he is," I said feebly. One of the men from the club came in, asked for the telephone, and I could hear him excitedly talking, saying something about coroners and detectives. Mr. Jarvis leaned over me. "Why don't you trust me, Miss Innes?" he said. "If I can do anything, I will. But tell me the whole thing." I did, finally, from the beginning, and when I told of Jack Bailey's being in the house that night, he gave a long whistle. "I wish they were both here," he said when I finished. "Whatever mad prank took them away, it would look better if they were here, especially—" "Especially what?" "Especially since Jack Bailey and Arnold Armstrong were notoriously bad friends. It was Bailey who got Arnold into trouble last spring, something about the bank, and then, too—" "Go on," I said. "If there is anything more, I ought to know." "There's nothing more," he said evasively. "There's just one thing we may bank on, Miss Innes. Any court in the country will acquit a man who kills an intruder in his house at night. If Halsey—" "Why, you don't think Halsey did it?" I exclaimed. There was a queer feeling of physical nausea coming over me. "No, not at all," he said with forced cheerfulness. "Come, Miss Innes, you're a ghost of yourself, and I am going to help you upstairs and call your maid. This has been too much for you." Liddy helped me back to bed, and, under the impression that I was in danger of freezing to death, put a hot water bottle over my heart and another at my feet. Then she left me. It was early dawn now, and from voices under the window I surmised that Mr. Jarvis and his companions were searching the grounds. As for me, I lay in bed with every faculty awake. Where had Halsey gone? How had he gone, and when? Before the murder, no doubt, but who would believe that? If either he or Jack Bailey had heard an intruder in the house and shot him, as they might have been justified in doing, why had they run away? The whole thing was unheard of, outrageous, and impossible to ignore. About 6 o'clock Gertrude came in. She was fully dressed, and I sat up nervously. "Poor auntie," she said. "What a shocking night you have had." She came over and sat down on the bed, and I saw she looked very tired and worn. "Is there anything new?" I asked anxiously. "Nothing. The car is gone, but Warner, he is the chauffeur, Warner is at the lodge and knows nothing about it." "Well," I said, "if I ever get my hands on Halsey Innes, I shall not let go until I have told him a few things. When we get this cleared up, I am going back to the city to be quiet. One more night like the last two will end me. The peace of the country. Fiddlesticks! Whereupon I told Gertrude of the noises the night before, and the figure on the veranda in the east wing. As an afterthought, I brought out the pearl cufflink. I have no doubt now, I said, that it was Arnold Armstrong the night before last, too. He had a key, no doubt, but why he should steal into his father's house I cannot imagine. He could have come with my permission easily enough. Anyhow, whoever it was that night left this little souvenir. Gertrude took one look at the cufflink and went as white as the pearls in it. She clutched at the foot of the bed and stood staring. As for me, I was quite as astonished as she was. "Where did you find it?" she asked finally, with a desperate effort at calm. And while I told her, she stood looking out of the window with a look I could not fathom on her face. It was a relief when Mrs. Watson tapped at the door and brought me some tea and toast. The cook was in bed, completely demoralized, she reported, and Liddy, brave with the daylight, was looking for footprints around the house. Mrs. Watson herself was a wreck. She was blue-white around the lips, and she had one hand tied up. She said she had fallen downstairs in her excitement. It was natural, of course, that the thing would shock her, having been the Armstrongs' housekeeper for several years, and knowing Mr. Arnold well. Gertrude had slipped out during my talk with Mrs. Watson, and I dressed and went downstairs. The billiard and card rooms were locked until the coroner and detectives got there, and the men from the club had gone back for more conventional clothing. I could hear Thomas in the pantry, alternately wailing for Mr. Arnold, as he called him, and citing the tokens that had precursed the murder. The house seemed to choke me, and, slipping a shawl around me, I went out on the drive. At the corner by the east wing I met Liddy. Her skirts were draggled with dew to her knees, and her hair was still in crimps. "Go right in and change your clothes," I said sharply. "You are a sight, and at your age." She had a golf stick in her hand, and she said she had found it on the lawn. There was nothing unusual about it, but it occurred to me that a golf stick with a metal end might have been the object that had scratched the stairs near the card room. I took it from her and sent her up for dry garments. Her daylight courage and self-importance, and her shuddering delight in the mystery, irritated me beyond words. After I left her, I made a circuit of the building. Nothing seemed to be disturbed. The house looked as calm and peaceful in the morning sun as it had the day I had been coerced into taking it. There was nothing to show that inside had been mystery and violence and sudden death. In one of the tulip beds back of the house was an early blackbird pecking viciously at something that glittered in the light. I picked my way gingerly over the dew and stooped down. Almost buried in the soft ground was a revolver. I scraped the earth off it with the tip of my shoe and picked it up, slipped it into my pocket. Not until I had got into my bedroom and double-locked the door did I venture to take it out and examine it. One look was all I needed. It was Halsey's revolver. I had unpacked it the day before and put it on his shaving stand, and there could be no mistake. His name was on a small silver plate on the handle. I seemed to see a network closing around my boy, innocent as I knew he was. The revolver, I am afraid of them, but anxiety gave me courage to look through the barrel. The revolver had still 2 bullets in it. I could only breathe a prayer of thankfulness that I had found the revolver before my sharp-eyed detective had come around. I decided to keep what clues I had, the cufflink, the golf stick, and the revolver, in a secure place until I could see some reason for displaying them. The cufflink had been dropped into a little filigree box on my toilet table. I opened the box and felt around for it. The box was empty. The cufflink had disappeared. Chapter 5. Gertrude's Engagement. At 10 o'clock, the Casanova hack brought up 3 men. They introduced themselves as the coroner of the county and 2 detectives from the city. The coroner led the way at once to the locked wing, and, with the aid of one of the detectives, examined the rooms and the body. The other detective, after a short scrutiny of the dead man, busied himself with the outside of the house. It was only after they had got a fair idea of things as they were that they sent for me. I received them in the living room, and I had made up my mind exactly what to tell. I had taken the house for the summer, I said, while the Armstrongs were in California. In spite of a rumor among the servants about strange noises, I cited Thomas, nothing had occurred the first 2 nights. On the 3rd night I believed that someone had been in the house. I had heard a crashing sound, but, being alone with one maid, had not investigated. The house had been locked in the morning and apparently undisturbed. Then, as clearly as I could, I related how, the night before, a shot had roused us, that my niece and I had investigated and found a body, that I did not know who the murdered man was until Mr. Jarvis from the club informed me, and that I knew of no reason why Mr. Arnold Armstrong should steal into his father's house at night. I should have been glad to allow him an entry there any time. "Have you reason to believe, Miss Innes," the coroner asked, "that any member of your household, imagining Mr. Armstrong was a burglar, shot him in self-defense?" "I have no reason for thinking so," I said quietly. "Your theory is that Mr. Armstrong was followed here by some enemy and shot as he entered the house." "I do not think I have a theory," I said. "The thing that has puzzled me is why Mr. Armstrong should enter his father's house 2 nights in succession, stealing in like a thief, when he need only to ask entrance to be admitted." The coroner was a very silent man. He took some notes after this, but he seemed anxious to make the next train back to town. He set the inquest for the following Sunday, and gave Mr. Jamieson, the younger of the 2 detectives, and the more intelligent-looking, a few instructions, and, after gravely shaking hands with me and regretting the unfortunate affair, took his departure, accompanied by the other detective. I was just beginning to breathe freely when Mr. Jamieson, who had been standing by the window, came over to me. "The family consists of yourself alone, Miss Innes. My niece is here," I said. "There is no one but yourself and your niece?" "My nephew." I had to moisten my lips. "Oh, a nephew. I should like to see him, if he is here." "He is not here just now," I said as quietly as I could. "I expect him at any time." "He was here yesterday evening, I believe." "No, yes." "Didn't he have a guest with him? Another man?" "He brought a friend with him to stay over Sunday. Mr. Bailey." "Mr. John Bailey, the cashier of the Traders' Bank, I believe." And I knew that someone at Greenwood Club had told him. "When did they leave?" "Very early. I don't know at just what time." Mr. Jamieson turned suddenly and looked at me. "Please try to be more explicit," he said. "You say your nephew and Mr. Bailey were in the house last night, and yet you and your niece, with some women servants, found the body. Where was your nephew?" I was entirely desperate by that time. "I do not know," I cried, "but be sure of this. Halsey knows nothing of this thing, and no amount of circumstantial evidence can make an innocent man guilty. Sit down, he said, pushing forward a chair. There are some things I have to tell you, and, in return, please tell me all you know. Believe me, things always come out. In the first place, Mr. Armstrong was shot from above. The bullet was fired at close range, entered below the shoulder, and came out, after passing through the heart, well down the back. In other words, I believe the murderer stood on the stairs and fired down. In the second place, I found on the edge of the billiard table a charred cigar which had burned itself partly out, and a cigarette which had consumed itself to the cork tip. Neither one had been more than lighted, then put down and forgotten. Have you any idea what it was that made your nephew and Mr. Bailey leave their cigars and their game, take out the automobile without calling the chauffeur, and all this at, let me see, certainly before 3 o'clock in the morning? I don't know, I said, but depend on it, Mr. Jamieson, Halsey will be back himself to explain everything. I sincerely hope so, he said. Miss Innes, has it occurred to you that Mr. Bailey might know something of this? Gertrude had come downstairs, and just as he spoke she came in. I saw her stop suddenly, as if she had been struck. He does not, she said in a tone that was not her own. Mr. Bailey and my brother know nothing of this. The murder was committed at 3. They left the house at 3:15. How do you know that? Mr. Jamieson asked oddly. Do you know at what time they left? I do, Gertrude answered firmly. At 3:15 my brother and Mr. Bailey left the house by the main entrance. I was there. Gertrude, I said excitedly, you are dreaming. Why, at 3:15. Listen, she said. At 2:30 the downstairs telephone rang. I had not gone to sleep, and I heard it. Then I heard Halsey answer it, and in a few minutes he came upstairs and knocked at my door. We talked for a minute. Then I put on my dressing gown and slippers and went downstairs with him. Mr. Bailey was in the billiard room. We all talked together for perhaps 10 minutes. Then it was decided that they should both go away. Can you be more explicit? Mr. Jamieson asked. Why did they go away? I am only telling you what happened, not why it happened, she said evenly. Halsey went for the car, and instead of bringing it to the house and rousing people, he went by the lower road from the stable. Mr. Bailey was to meet him at the foot of the lawn. Mr. Bailey left. Which way? Mr. Jamieson asked sharply. By the main entrance. He left. It was 2:45. I know exactly. The clock in the hall has stopped, Miss Innes, said Jamieson. Nothing seemed to escape him. He looked at his watch, she replied, and I could see Mr. Jamieson snap, as if he had made a discovery. As for myself, during the whole recital I had been plunged into the deepest amazement. Will you pardon me for a personal question? The detective was a youngish man, and I thought he was somewhat embarrassed. What are your relations with Mr. Bailey? Gertrude hesitated. Then she came over and put her hand lovingly in mine. I am engaged to marry him, she said simply. I had grown so accustomed to surprises that I could only gasp again, and as for Gertrude, the hand that lay in mine was burning with fever. And after that, Mr. Jamieson went on, you went directly to bed? Gertrude hesitated. No, she said finally. I am not nervous, and after I had extinguished the light, I remembered something I had left in the billiard room, and I felt my way back there through the darkness. Will you tell me what it was you had forgotten? I cannot tell you, she said slowly. I did not leave the billiard room at once. Why? The detective's tone was imperative. This is very important, Miss Innes. I was crying, Gertrude said in a low tone. When the French clock in the drawing-room struck 3, I got up, and then I heard a step on the east porch, just outside the card-room. Someone with a key was working with the latch, and I thought, of course, of Halsey. When we took the house, he called that his entrance, and he had carried a key for it ever since. The door opened, and I was about to ask what he had forgotten, when there was a flash and a report. Some heavy body dropped, and, half crazed with terror and shock, I ran through the drawing-room and got upstairs. I scarcely remember how. She dropped into a chair, and I thought Mr. Jamieson must have finished, but he was not through. You certainly clear your brother and Mr. Bailey admirably, he said. The testimony is invaluable, especially in view of the fact that your brother and Mr. Armstrong had, I believe, quarreled rather seriously some time ago. Nonsense, I broke in. Things are bad enough, Mr. Jamieson, without inventing bad feeling where it doesn't exist. Gertrude, I don't think Halsey knew the murdered man, did he? But Mr. Jamieson was sure of his ground. The quarrel, I believe, he persisted, was about Mr. Armstrong's conduct to you, Miss Gertrude. He had been paying you unwelcome attentions. And I had never seen the man. When she nodded a yes, I saw the tremendous possibilities involved. If the detective could prove that Gertrude feared and disliked the murdered man, and that Mr. Armstrong had been annoying and possibly pursuing her with hateful intentions, all that, added to Gertrude's confession of her presence in the billiard room at the time of the crime, looked strange, to say the least. The prominence of the family assured a strenuous effort to find the murder, and if we had nothing worse to look forward to, we were sure of a distasteful publicity. Mr. Jamieson shut his notebook with a snap and thanked us. I have an idea, he said, apropos of nothing at all, that at any rate the ghost is laid here. Whatever the rappings have been, and the colored man says they began when the family went west 3 months ago, they are likely to stop now. Which shows how much he knew about it. The ghost was not laid. With the murder of Arnold Armstrong, he, or it, only seemed to take on fresh vigor. Mr. Jamieson left then, and when Gertrude had gone upstairs, as she did at once, I sat and thought over what I had just heard. Her engagement, once so engrossing a matter, paled now beside the significance of her story. If Halsey and Jack Bailey had left before the crime, how came Halsey's revolver in the tulip bed? What was the mysterious cause of their sudden flight? What had Gertrude left in the billiard room? What was the significance of the cufflink? And where was it? Chapter 6. In the East Corridor. When the detective left, he enjoined absolute secrecy on everybody in the household. The Greenwood Club promised the same thing, and as there are no Sunday afternoon papers, the murder was not publicly known until Monday. The coroner himself notified the Armstrong family lawyer, and early in the afternoon he came out. I had not seen Mr. Jamieson since morning, but I knew he had been interrogating the servants. Gertrude was locked in her room with a headache, and I had luncheon alone. Mr. Harton, the lawyer, was a little thin man, and he looked as if he did not relish his business that day. "This is very unfortunate, Miss Innes," he said, after we had shaken hands. "Most unfortunate, and mysterious. With the father and mother in the West, I find everything devolves on me, and, as you can understand, it is an unpleasant duty." "No doubt," I said absently. "Mr. Harton, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I hope you will answer them. I feel that I am entitled to some knowledge, because I and my family are just now in a most ambiguous position." I don't know whether he understood me or not. He took off his glasses and wiped them. "I shall be very happy," he said, with old-fashioned courtesy. "Thank you. Mr. Harton, did Mr. Arnold Armstrong know that Sunnyside had been rented?" "I think, yes, he did. In fact, I myself told him about it." "And he knew who the tenants were?" "Yes. He had not been living with the family for some years, I believe?" "No. Unfortunately, there had been trouble between Arnold and his father. For 2 years he had lived in town." "Then it would be unlikely that he came here last night to get possession of anything belonging to him?" "I should think it hardly possible," he admitted. "To be perfectly frank, Miss Innes, I cannot think of any reason whatever for his coming here as he did. He had been staying at the clubhouse across the valley for the last week, Jarvis tells me, but that only explains how he came here, not why. It is a most unfortunate family." He shook his head despondently, and I felt that this dried-up little man was the repository of much that he had not told me. I gave up trying to elicit any information from him, and we went together to view the body before it was taken to the city. It had been lifted onto the billiard table and a sheet thrown over it. Otherwise nothing had been touched. A soft hat lay beside it, and the collar of the dinner coat was still turned up. The handsome, dissipated face of Arnold Armstrong, purged of its ugly lines, was now only pathetic. As we went in, Mrs. Watson appeared at the card-room door. "Come in, Mrs. Watson," the lawyer said, but she shook her head and withdrew. She was the only one in the house who seemed to regret the dead man, and even she seemed rather shocked than sorry. I went to the door at the foot of the circular staircase and opened it. If I could only have seen Halsey coming at his usual hair-brained clip up the drive, if I could have heard the throb of the motor, I would have felt that my troubles were over. But there was nothing to be seen. The countryside lay sunny and quiet in its peaceful Sunday afternoon calm, and far down the drive Mr. Jamieson was walking slowly, stooping now and then, as if to examine the road. When I went back, Mr. Harton was furtively wiping his eyes. "The prodigal has come home, Miss Innes," he said. "How often the sins of the fathers are visited on the children," which left me pondering. Before Mr. Harton left, he told me something of the Armstrong family. Paul Armstrong, the father, had been married twice. Arnold was a son by the first marriage. The second Mrs. Armstrong had been a widow with a child, a little girl. The child, now perhaps 20, was Louise Armstrong, having taken her stepfather's name, and was at present in California with the family. "They will probably return at once," he concluded. "Sad part of my errand here today is to see if you will relinquish your lease here in their favor." "We would better wait and see if they wish to come," I said. "It seems unlikely, and my townhouse is being remodeled." At that he let the matter drop, but it came up unpleasantly enough later. At 6 o'clock the body was taken away, and at 7:30, after an early dinner, Mr. Harton went. Gertrude had not come down, and there was no news of Halsey. Mr. Jamieson had taken a lodging in the village, and I had not seen him since mid-afternoon. It was about 9 o'clock, I think, when the bell rang and he was ushered into the living room. "Sit down," I said grimly. "Have you found a clue that will incriminate me, Mr. Jamieson?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "No," he said. "If you had killed Mr. Armstrong, you would have left no clues. You would have had too much intelligence." After that, we got along better. He was fishing in his pocket, and after a minute he brought out 2 scraps of paper. "I have been to the clubhouse," he said, "and among Mr. Armstrong's effects I found these. One is curious, the other is puzzling." The first was a sheet of club notepaper on which was written, over and over, the name Halsey B. Innes. It was Halsey's flowing signature to a dot, but it lacked Halsey's ease. The ones at the bottom of the sheet were much better than the top ones. Mr. Jamieson smiled at my face. "His old tricks," he said. "That one is merely curious. This one, as I said before, is puzzling." The second scrap, folded and refolded into a compass so tiny that the writing had been partly obliterated, was part of a letter, the lower half of a sheet, not typed, but written in a cramped hand. "By altering the plans for rooms may be possible. The best way, in my opinion, would be to the plan for, in one of the rooms, chimney." That was all. "Well," I said, looking up, "there's nothing in that, is there? A man ought to be able to change the plan of his house without becoming an object of suspicion." "There is little in the paper itself," he admitted. "But why should Arnold Armstrong carry that around, unless it meant something? He never built a house, you may be sure of that. If it is this house, it may mean anything, from a secret room to an extra bathroom," I said scornfully. "Haven't you a thumbprint, too?" "I have," he said with a smile, "and the print of a foot in the tulip bed, and a number of other things. The oddest part is, Miss Innes, that the thumbprint is probably yours, and the footprint certainly." His audacity was the only thing that saved me. His amused smile put me on my mettle, and I ripped out a perfectly good scallop before I answered. "Why did I step into the tulip bed?" I asked with interest. "You picked up something," he said good-humoredly, "which you are going to tell me about later." "Am I indeed?" I was politely curious. "With this remarkable insight of yours, I wish you would tell me where I shall find my $4,000 motor car." "I was just coming to that," he said. "You will find it about 30 miles away at Andrews Station in a blacksmith shop where it is being repaired." I laid down my knitting then and looked at him. "And Halsey," I managed to say. "We are going to exchange information," he said. "I am going to tell you that when you tell me what you picked up in the tulip bed." We looked steadily at each other. It was not an unfriendly stare. We were only measuring weapons. Then he smiled a little and got up. "With your permission," he said, "I'm going to examine the card room and the staircase again. You might think over my offer in the meantime." He went on through the drawing room, and I listened to his footsteps growing gradually fainter. I dropped my pretense at knitting, and, leaning back, I thought over the last 48 hours. Here was I, Rachel Innes, spinster, a granddaughter of old John Innes of Revolutionary days, a DAR, a colonial dame, mixed up with a vulgar and revolting crime, and even attempting to hoodwink the law. Certainly I had left the straight and narrow way. I was roused by hearing Mr. Jamieson coming rapidly back through the drawing-room. He stopped at the door. "Miss Innes," he said quickly, "will you come with me and light the east corridor? I have fastened somebody in the small room at the head of the card-room stairs." I jumped up at once. "You mean the murderer?" I gasped. "Possibly," he said quietly, as we hurried together up the stairs. Someone was lurking on the staircase when I went back. I spoke. Instead of an answer, whoever it was turned and ran up. I followed. It was dark, but as I turned the corner at the top, a figure darted through this door and closed it. The bolt was on my side, and I pushed it forward. It is a closet, I think. We are in the upper hall now. If you will show me the electric switch, Miss Innes, you had better wait in your own room. Trembling as I was determined to see that door opened. I hardly knew what I feared, but so many terrible and inexplicable things had happened that suspense was worse than certainty. "I am perfectly cool," I said, "and I am going to remain here." The lights flashed up along that end of the corridor, throwing the doors into relief. At the intersection of the small hallway with the larger, the circular staircase wound its way up, as if it had been an afterthought of the architect. And just around the corner, in the small corridor, was the door Mr. Jamieson had indicated. I was still unfamiliar with the house, and I did not remember the door. My heart was thumping wildly in my ears, but I nodded to him to go ahead. It was perhaps 8 or 10 feet away, and then he threw the bolt back. "Come out," he said quietly. There was no response. "Come out," he repeated. Then, I think he had a revolver, but I am not sure, he stepped aside and threw open the door. From where I stood, I could not see beyond the door, but I saw Mr. Jamieson's face change and heard him mutter something. Then he bolted down the stairs 3 at a time. When my knees had stopped shaking, I moved forward, slowly, nervously, until I had a partial view of what was beyond the door. It seemed at first to be a closet, empty. Then I went close and examined it, to stop with a shudder. Where the floor should have been was black void and darkness, from which came the indescribable damp smell of the cellars. Mr. Jamieson had locked somebody in the clothes chute. As I leaned over, I fancied I heard a groan. Or was it the wind? Chapter 7. A Sprained Ankle. I was panic-stricken. As I ran along the corridor, I was confident that the mysterious intruder and probable murderer had been found, and that he lay dead or dying at the foot of the chute. I got down the staircase somehow, and through the kitchen to the basement stairs. Mr. Jamieson had been before me, and the door stood open. Liddy was standing in the middle of the kitchen, holding a frying pan by the handle as a weapon. "Don't go down there," she yelled when she saw me moving toward the basement stairs. "Don't you do it, Miss Rachel. That Jamieson's down there now. There's only trouble comes of hunting ghosts. They lead you into bottomless pits and things like that. Oh, Miss Rachel, don't," as I tried to get past her. She was interrupted by Mr. Jamieson's reappearance. He ran up the stairs 2 at a time, and his face was flushed and furious. "The whole place is locked," he said angrily. "Where's the laundry key kept?" "It's kept in the door," Liddy snapped. "That whole end of the cellar is kept locked, so nobody can get at the clothes. And then the key's left in the door, so that unless a thief was as blind as some detectives, he could walk right in." "Liddy," I said sharply, "come down with us and turn on all the lights." She offered her resignation, as usual, on the spot, but I took her by the arm, and she came along finally. She switched on all the lights and pointed to a door just ahead. "That's the door," she said sulkily. "The key's in it." But the key was not in it. Mr. Jamieson shook it, but it was a heavy door, well locked. And then he stooped and began punching around the keyhole with the end of a lead pencil. When he stood up, his face was exultant. "It's locked on the inside," he said in a low tone. "There is somebody in there." "Lord have mercy!" gasped Liddy, and turned to run. "Liddy," I called, "go through the house at once and see who is missing, or if anyone is. We'll have to clear this thing at once. Mr. Jamieson, if you will watch here, I will go to the lodge and find Warner. Thomas will be of no use. Together, you may be able to force the door." "A good idea," he assented, "but there are windows, of course, and there's nothing to prevent whoever is in there from getting out that way." "Then lock the door at the top of the basement stairs," I suggested, "and patrol the house from the outside." We agreed to this, and I had a feeling that the mystery of Sunnyside was about to be solved. I ran down the steps and up along the drive. Just at the corner, I ran full tilt into somebody who seemed to be as much alarmed as I was. It was not until I had recoiled a step or two that I recognized Gertrude, and she me. "Good gracious, Aunt Ray," she exclaimed, "what is the matter?" "There's somebody locked in the laundry," I panted. "That is, unless... You don't see anyone crossing the lawn or skulking around the house, did you?" "I think we have mystery on the brain," said Gertrude wearily. "No, I haven't seen anyone except old Thomas, who looked for all the world as if he had been ransacking the pantry. What have you locked in the laundry?" "I can't wait to explain," I replied. "I must get Warner from the lodge. If you came out for air, you'd better put on your overshoes." And then I noticed that Gertrude was limping, not much, but sufficiently to make her progress very slow and seemingly painful. "You have hurt yourself," I said sharply. "I fell over the carriage block," she explained. "I thought perhaps I might see Halsey coming home. He ought to be here." I turned on down the drive. The lodge was some distance from the house, in a group of trees where the drive met the country road. There were 2 white stone pillars to mark the entrance, but the iron gates, one closed and tended by the lodge-keeper, now stood permanently open. The day of the motor car had come. No one had time for closed gates and lodge-keepers. The lodge at Sunnyside was merely a sort of supplementary servants' quarters. It was as convenient in its appointments as the big house, and infinitely more cozy. As I went down the drive, my thoughts were busy. Who would it be that Mr. Jamieson had trapped in the cellar? Would we find a body or someone badly injured? Scarcely either. Whoever had fallen had been able to lock the laundry door on the inside. If the fugitive had come from outside the house, how did he get in? If it was some member of the household, who could it have been? And then, a feeling of horror almost overwhelmed me. Gertrude! Gertrude and her injured ankle. Gertrude found limping slowly up the drive when I had thought she was in bed. I tried to put the thought away, but it would not go. If Gertrude had been on the circular staircase that night, why had she fled from Mr. Jamieson? The idea, puzzling as it was, seemed borne out by this circumstance. Whoever had taken refuge at the head of the stairs could scarcely have been familiar with the house, or with the location of the chute. The mystery seemed to deepen constantly. What possible connection could there be between Halsey and Gertrude and the murder of Arnold Armstrong? And yet, everywhere I turned, I seemed to find something that pointed to such a connection. At the foot of the drive, the road described a long, sloping, horseshoe-shaped curve around the lodge. There were lights there, streaming cheerfully out onto the trees, and from an upper room came wavering shadows, as if someone with a lamp was moving around. I had come almost silently in my evening slippers, and I had my second collision of the evening on the road just above the house. I ran full into a man in a long coat who was standing in the shadow beside the drive, with his back to me, watching the lighted windows. "What the hell?" he ejaculated furiously, and turned around. When he saw me, however, he did not wait for any retort on my part. He faded away. This is not slang. He did. He absolutely disappeared in the dusk without getting more than a glimpse of his face. I had a vague impression of unfamiliar features and of a sort of cap with a visor. Then he was gone. I went into the lodge and rapped. It required 2 or 3 poundings to bring Thomas to the door, and he opened it only an inch or so. "Where's Warner?" I asked. I think he's in bed, ma'am." "Get him up," I said, "and for goodness sake, open the door, Thomas. I'll wait for Warner." "It's kinda close in here, ma'am," he said, obeying gingerly, and disclosing a cool and comfortable-looking interior. "Perhaps you'd care to set up on the porch and rest yourself." It was so evident that Thomas did not want me inside that I went in. "Tell Warner he is needed in a hurry," I repeated, and turned into the little sitting room. I could hear Thomas going up the stairs, could hear him rouse Warner, and the steps of the chauffeur as he hurriedly dressed, but my attention was busy with the room below. On the center table, open, was a sealskin traveling bag. It was filled with gold-topped bottles and brushes, and it breathed opulence, luxury, femininity from every inch of surface. How did it get there? I was still asking myself the question when Warner came running down the stairs and into the room. He was completely but somewhat incongruously dressed, and his open, boyish face looked ashamed. He was a country boy, absolutely frank and reliable, of a fair education and intelligence, one of the small army of American youths who turn a natural aptitude for mechanics into the special field of the automobile and earn good salaries in a congenial occupation. "What is it, Miss Innes?" he asked anxiously. "There is someone locked in the laundry," I replied. "Mr. Jamieson wants you to help him break the lock. Warner, whose bag is this?" He was in the doorway by this time, and he pretended not to hear. "Warner," I called, "come back here. Whose bag is that?" He stopped then, but he did not turn around. It belongs to Thomas," he said, and fled up the drive. To Thomas! A London bag with mirrors and cosmetic jars, of which Thomas could not even have guessed the use. However, I put the bag in the back of my mind, which was fast becoming stored with anomalies and apparently irreconcilable facts, and followed Warner to the house. Liddy had come back to the kitchen. The door to the basement stairs was double-barred, and had a table pushed against it, and beside her on the table was most of the kitchen paraphernalia. "Did you see if there was anyone missing in the house?" I asked, ignoring the array of saucepans, rolling pins, and the poker of the range. "Rosie is missing," Liddy said with unction. She had objected to Rosie, the parlour maid, from the start. Mrs. Watson went into her room and found she had gone without her hat. People that trust themselves a dozen miles from the city, in strange houses, with servants they don't know, needn't be surprised if they wake up some morning and find their throats cut. After which carefully veiled sarcasm, Liddy relapsed into gloom. Warner came in then with a handful of small tools, and Mr. Jamieson went with him to the basement. Oddly enough, I was not alarmed. With all my heart I wished for Halsey, but I was not frightened. At the door he was to force, Warner put down his tools and looked at it. Then he turned the handle. Without the slightest difficulty the door opened, revealing the blackness of the drawing-room beyond. Mr. Jamieson gave an exclamation of disgust. "Gone," he said. "Confound such careless work. I might have known." It was true enough. We got the lights on finally, and looked all through the 3 rooms that constituted this wing of the basement. Everything was quiet and empty. An explanation of how the fugitive had escaped injury was found in a heaped-up basket of clothes under the chute. The basket had been overturned, but that was all. Mr. Jamieson examined the windows. One was unlocked and offered an easy escape. The window or the door? Which way had the fugitive escaped? The door seemed most probable, and I hoped it had been so. I could not have borne, just then, to think that it was my poor Gertrude we had been hounding through the darkness, and yet I had met Gertrude not far from that very window. I went upstairs at last, tired and depressed. Mrs. Watson and Liddy were making tea in the kitchen. In certain walks of life, the teapot is the refuge in times of stress, trouble, or sickness. They give tea to the dying, and they put it in the baby's nursing bottle. Mrs. Watson was fixing a tray to be sent in to me, and when I asked her about Rosie, she confirmed her absence. "She's not here," she said, "but I would not think much of it, Miss Innes. Rosie is a pretty young girl, and perhaps she has a sweetheart. It will be a good thing if she has. The maids stay much better when they have something like that to hold them here." Gertrude had gone back to her room, and while I was drinking my cup of hot tea, Mr. Jamieson came in. "We might take up the conversation where we left off an hour and a half ago," he said. "But before we go on, I want to say this. The person who escaped from the laundry was a woman with a foot of moderate size and well arched. She wore nothing but a stocking on her right foot, and in spite of the unlocked door, she escaped by the window." And again I thought of Gertrude's sprained ankle. Was it the right or the left? Chapter 8. The Other Half of the Line. "Miss Innes," the detective began, "what is your opinion of the figure you saw on the east veranda the night you and your maid were in the house alone?" "It was a woman," I said positively. "And yet your maid affirms with equal positiveness that it was a man." "Nonsense," I broke in. "Liddy had her eyes shut. She always shuts them when she's frightened." "And you never thought then that the intruder who came later that night might be a woman? The woman, in fact, whom you saw on the veranda?" "I had reasons for thinking it was a man," I said, remembering the pearl cufflink. "Now we are getting down to business. What were your reasons for thinking that?" I hesitated. "If you have any reason for believing that your midnight guest was Mr. Armstrong, other than his visit here the next night, you ought to tell me, Miss Innes. We can take nothing for granted. If, for instance, the intruder who dropped the bar and scratched the staircase, you see, I know about that, if this visitor was a woman, why should not the same woman have come back the following night, met Mr. Armstrong on the circular staircase, and in alarm shot him?" "It was a man," I reiterated, and then, because I could think of no other reason for my statement, I told him about the pearl cufflink. He was intensely interested. "Will you give me the link?" he said when I finished, "or, at least, let me see it? I consider it a most important clue. Won't the description do?" "Not as well as the original." "Well, I'm very sorry," I said, as calmly as I could. The thing is lost. It must have fallen out of a box on my dressing table." Whatever he thought of my explanation, and I knew he doubted it, he made no sign. He asked me to describe the link accurately, and I did so, while he glanced at a list he took from his pocket. "1 set monogram cufflinks," he read. "1 set plain pearl links. one set cufflinks, woman's, head set with diamonds and emeralds. There is no mention of such a link as you describe, and yet, if your theory is right, Mr. Armstrong must have taken back in his cuffs one complete cufflink and a half, perhaps, of the other. The idea was new to me. If it had not been the murdered man who had entered the house that night, who had it been? There are a number of strange things connected with this case, the detective went on. Miss Gertrude Innes testified that she heard someone fumbling with the lock, that the door opened, and that almost immediately the shot was fired. Now, Miss Innes, here is the strange part of that. Mr. Armstrong had no key with him. There was no key in the lock, or on the floor. In other words, the evidence points absolutely to this. Mr. Armstrong was admitted to the house from within. It is possible, I broke in. Mr. Jamieson, do you know what your words imply? Do you know that you are practically accusing Gertrude Innes of admitting that man? Not quite that, he said with his friendly smile. In fact, Miss Innes, I am quite certain she did not. But as long as I learn only parts of the truth from both you and her, what can I do? I know you picked up something in the flower bed. You refused to tell me what it was. I know Miss Gertrude went back to the billiard room to get something. She refuses to say what. You suspect what happened to the cufflink, but you won't tell me. So far, all I am sure of is this. I do not believe Arnold Armstrong was the midnight visitor who so alarmed you by dropping, shall we say, a golf stick? And I believe that when he did come, he was admitted by someone in the house. Who knows? It may have been Liddy. I stirred my tea angrily. I have always heard, I said dryly, that undertakers' assistants are jovial young men. A man's sense of humor seems to be in inverse proportion to the gravity of his profession. A man's sense of humor is a barbarous and a cruel thing, Miss Innes, he admitted. It is to the feminine as the hug of a bear is to the scratch of, well, anything with claws. Is that you, Thomas? Come in. Thomas Johnson stood in the doorway. He looked alarmed and apprehensive, and suddenly I remembered the sealskin dressing bag in the lodge. Thomas came just inside the door and stood with his head drooping, his eyes, under their shaggy grey brows, fixed on Mr. Jamieson. Thomas, said the detective, not unkindly, I sent for you to tell us what you told Sam Bohannon at the club the day before Mr. Arnold was found here dead. Let me see. You came here Friday night to see Miss Innes, didn't you? And came to work here Saturday morning? For some unexplained reason, Thomas looked relieved. Yes, sir, he said. You see, it were like this. When Mr. Armstrong and his family went away, Miss Watson and me, we was left in charge till the place was rented. Miss Watson, she been here a good while, and she warn't skeery, so she slept in the house. I'd been having tokens. I told Miss Innes some of 'em, and I slept in the lodge. Then one day Miss Watson, she came to me, and she says she, Thomas, you'll have to sleep up in the big house. I'm too nervous to do it any more. But I just reckoned to myself that if it's too scary for her, it's too scary for me. We had it then, sure enough, and it ended with Miss Watson staying in the lodge nights and me looking for work at the club. Did Mrs. Watson say anything had happened to alarm her? No, sir. She was just naturally scared. Well, that was all, far as I know, until the night I come over to see Miss Innes. I come across the valley. along the path from the clubhouse, and I goes home that way. Down in the creek bottom I almost run into a man. He was standing with his back to me, and he was working with one of these electric light things that fits in your pocket. He was having trouble. One minute it'd flash out, and the next it'd be gone. I had a view of his white dress shirt and tie as I passed. I didn't see his face, but I know it warn't Mr. Arnold. It was a taller man than Mr. Arnold. Beside that, Mr. Arnold was playing cards when I got to the clubhouse, same's he'd been doing all day. And the next morning you came back along the path, pursued Mr. Jamieson relentlessly. The next morning I come back along the path and down where I done see the man night before. I picked up this here. The old man held out a tiny object, and Mr. Jamieson took it. Then he held it on his extended palm for me to see. It was the other half of the pearl cufflink. But Mr. Jamieson was not quite through questioning him. And so you showed it to Sam at the club and asked him if he knew anyone who owned such a link. And Sam said, what? Well, Sam, he 'lows he'd seen such a pair of cuff buttons in a shirt belonging to Mr. Bailey, Mr. Jack Bailey, sir. I'll keep this link, Thomas, for a while, the detective said. That's all I wanted to know. Good night. As Thomas shuffled out, Mr. Jamieson watched me sharply. You see, Miss Innes, he said, Mr. Bailey insists on mixing himself with this thing. If Mr. Bailey came here that Friday night expecting to meet Arnold Armstrong and missed him, if, as I say, he had done this, might he not, seeing him enter the following night, have struck him down as he had intended before? But the motive, I gasped. There could be motive proved, I think. Arnold Armstrong and John Bailey have been enemies since the latter, as cashier of the Traders' Bank, brought Arnold almost into the clutches of the law. Also, you forget that both men have been paying attention to Miss Gertrude. Bailey's flight looks bad, too. And you think Halsey helped him to escape. Unfortunately. Why, what could it be but flight? Miss Innes, let me reconstruct that evening as I see it. Bailey and Armstrong had quarreled at the club. I learned that today. Your nephew brought Bailey over. Prompted by jealous, insane fury, Armstrong followed, coming across by the path. He entered the billiard-room wing, perhaps rapping and being admitted by your nephew. Just inside he was shot, by someone on the circular staircase. The shot fired, your nephew and Bailey left the house at once, going toward the automobile house. They left by the lower road, which prevented them from being heard, and when you and Miss Gertrude got downstairs, everything was quiet. But Gertrude's story, I stammered. Miss Gertrude only brought forward her explanation the following morning. I do not believe it, Miss Innes. It is the story of a loving and ingenious woman. And this thing tonight may upset my whole view of the case. We must give the benefit of every doubt, after all. We may, for instance, come back to the figure on the porch. If it was a woman you saw that night through the window, we might start with other premises. Or Mr. Innes's explanation may turn us in a new direction. It is possible that he shot Arnold Armstrong as a burglar and then fled, frightened at what he had done. In any case, however, I feel confident that the body was here when he left. Mr. Armstrong left the club ostensibly for a moonlight saunter, about half after 11 o'clock. It was 3 when the shot was fired. I leaned back, bewildered. It seemed to me that the evening had been full of significant happenings, and I only held the key. Had Gertrude been the fugitive in the clothes chute? Who was the man on the drive near the lodge? And whose gold-mounted dressing-bag had I seen in the lodge sitting-room? It was late when Mr. Jamieson finally got up to go. I went with him to the door, and together we stood looking out over the valley. Below lay the village of Casanova, with its old-world houses, its blossoming trees, and its peace. Above, on the hill across the valley, were the lights of the Greenwood Club. It was even possible to see the curving row of parallel lights that marked the carriage road. Rumors that I had heard about the club came back, of drinking, of high play, and once, a year ago, of a suicide under those very lights. Mr. Jamieson left, taking a short cut to the village, and I stood there. It must have been after 11, and the monotonous tick of the big clock on the stairs behind me was the only sound. Then I was conscious that someone was running up the drive. In a minute, a woman darted into the area of light made by the open door, and caught me by the arm. It was Rosie in a state of collapse from terror, and, not the least important, clutching one of my Coalport plates and a silver spoon. She stood staring into the darkness behind, still holding the plate. I got her into the house and secured the plate. Then I stood and looked down at her, where she crouched tremblingly against the doorway. "Well," I asked, "didn't your young man enjoy his meal?" She couldn't speak. She looked at the spoon she still held. I wasn't so anxious about it, thank heavens, it wouldn't chip. And then she stared at me. "I appreciate your desire to have everything nice for him," I went on, "but next time you may take the Limoges china. It's more easily duplicated and less expensive." "I haven't a young man, not here." She got her breath now, as I had guessed she would. I have been chased by a thief, Miss Innes." "Did he chase you out of the house and back again?" I asked. Then Rosie began to cry, not silently but noisily, hysterically. I stopped her by giving her a good shake. "What in the world is the matter with you?" I snapped. "Has the day of good common sense gone by? Sit up and tell me the whole thing." Rosie sat up then and sniffled. "I was coming up the drive," she began. "You must start with when you went down the drive with my dishes and my silver," I interrupted, but seeing more signs of hysteria, I gave in. "Very well. You were coming up the drive. I had a basket of silver and dishes on my arm, and I was carrying the plate because I was afraid I'd break it. Part way up the road, a man stepped out of the bushes and held his arms like this, spread out, so I couldn't get past. He said, 'Not so fast, young lady. I want you to let me see what's in that basket.'" She got up in excitement and took hold of my arm. "It was like this, Miss Innes," she said, "and say you was the man. When he said that, I screamed and ducked under his arm like this. He caught up the basket, and I dropped it. I ran as fast as I could, and he came after as far as the trees. Then he stopped. Oh, Miss Innes, it must have been the man that killed that Mr. Armstrong." "Don't be foolish," I said. "Whoever killed Mr. Armstrong would put as much space between himself and this house as he could. Go up to bed now, and mind, if I hear of this story being repeated to the other maids, I shall deduct from your wages for every broken dish I find in the drive." I listened to Rosie as she went upstairs, running past the shadowy places and slamming her door. Then I sat down and looked at the Coalport plate and the silver spoon. I had brought my own china and silver, and, from all appearances, I would have little enough to take back. But though I might jeer at Rosie as much as I wished, the fact remained that someone had been on the drive that night who had no business there. Although neither had Rosie, for that matter. I could fancy Liddy's face when she missed the extra pieces of china. She had opposed Rosie from the start. If Lydie once finds a prophecy fulfilled, especially an unpleasant one, she never allows me to forget it. It seemed to me that it was absurd to leave that china dotted along the road for her to spy the next morning, so with a sudden resolution I opened the door again and stepped out into the darkness. As the door closed behind me, I half regretted my impulse, then shut my teeth and went on. I have never been a nervous woman, I said before. Moreover, a minute or two in the darkness enabled me to see things fairly well. Beulah gave me rather a start by rubbing unexpectedly against my feet. Then we two, side by side, went down the drive. There were no fragments of china, but where the grove began I picked up a silver spoon. So far, Rosie's story was borne out. I began to wonder if it were not indiscreet, to say the least, this midnight prowling in a neighborhood with such a deservedly bad reputation. Then I saw something gleaming, which proved to be the handle of a cup, and a step or two farther on I found a V-shaped bit of a plate. But the most surprising thing of all was to find the basket, sitting comfortably beside the road, with the rest of the broken crockery piled neatly within, and a handful of small silver spoons, forks, and the like on top. I could only stand and stare. Then Rosie's story was true. But where had Rosie carried her basket? And why had the thief, if he were a thief, picked up the broken china out of the road and left it with his booty? It was with my nearest approach to a nervous collapse that I heard the familiar throbbing of an automobile engine. As it came closer, I recognized the outline of the dragonfly, and knew that Halsey had come back. Strange enough it must have seemed to Halsey, too, to come across me in the middle of the night, with the skirt of my grey silk gown over my shoulders to keep off the dew, holding a red and green basket under one arm and a black cat under the other. What with relief and joy, I began to cry, right there, and very nearly wiped my eyes on Beulah in excitement. And I think that's an excellent place to stop for the night. I believe I read more of that than I intended. How long have I been going? Alright, can't see stream time when I use restream. Oh, I'd say good night to Seacross, but I'm sure he's long gone. But hey there, Team Wildwood. Welcome in. And Dragon of the West, thank you for the lurk. And Doji Lawn. Hey, good to see you here again. Hope I'm not keeping you awake. Or perhaps I've helped you drift off to sleep by now. And hey, Auburn Dusk, welcome in. Okay, hour and a half. Yeah, I'm moving through this book at a decent pace. I think we got through about another 50 pages tonight. Still a good ways to go. Yeah, but the mystery's getting more and more complicated. Enjoying it so far. There's not a lot of the characters are especially deep yet, but they have their share of secrets. Yeah, it's good to see all you guys. I hope you're having a good night and been enjoying the story. Yeah, it's early enough on, and there's so much going on. I couldn't even begin to guess what's happening. That'll be fun to see who's lying and see to what degree the elder Miss Innes comes to trust Detective Jamieson, or Mr. Jamieson. I realize she's calling Mrs. Watson that because she's the housekeeper. And that's why, what's his name, Thomas is calling her Miss Watson. It is the more generic, because I'm guessing she's not married. I wonder if you're talking about the housekeeper who's the head of a house with like a wait staff, you're supposed to say mistress rather than Mrs. Can't believe I never actually looked that up before. I know I've thought that. Weird English language. Oh, damn, it's much later than I thought. But I'm glad I got to hang out and do the audiobook stream. Took my mind off with any annoyances I must face. I think I'm not making as many mistakes as I used to. Probably would make even less and do it more smoothly if I did it earlier when I wasn't tired. Also, when I don't have a spot of allergies. Let me find somebody to raid. But to give you guys an idea of what's coming up, on Wednesday we'll continue Leather Goddesses of Phobos and hope that it's every bit as titillating as it sounds. And that if we get soft locked, we at least realize it. And then Saturday, for Short Horror Saturday,
Streamer, game on stream. Streamer, I'm afraid. Streamer, you must pause my stream. Streamer, got a raid. Here's a raider leading raiders. Welcome raiders. Are the raiders alligators? Raider, grackle.
I was actually just thinking, I wonder if Matt's Game Room is still online and we can raid him. You guys, please go check out Matt's Game Room. It was a retro streamer and also does like hardware streams. I saw that was what you were working on tonight. And how did that go? And welcome in, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Purblind Gamer. I'm a legally blind retro and variety streamer who plays some adventure games, some action games, and has a particular fondness for horror. And actually tonight we're doing something less common. I was reading this old murder mystery from the 1900s, like an audiobook. And getting pretty twisty and turny. It's a fun time. But yeah, see how that's going. Oh hey, Team Wildwood, you're back. I don't know if I said earlier, you guys, please do go check out Team Wildwood. It's been going through Final Fantasy III. And Dawn Retro. Good to have you here. Oh, you still have more testing to do in Matt's Game Room, but... Oh, you finished the soldering. Great. And Toastio. Yes, please go check out Toastio as well, who's a retro streamer. No, thank you so much for the raid. We were actually just about to finish up, and I was just about to find somebody to raid. As we got through several chapters of the book tonight. The circular staircase. Interesting stuff. Oh, the soldering was the hardest part, so that's going to be good if the rest is easy. And you'll finish Final Fantasy III tomorrow, yeah. Hopefully so, Team Wildwood. Yeah, appreciate you coming in on the raid train, Dom Retro. Yeah, we do, occasionally I do these audiobook streams, sort of like bonuses. Like normally I stream Wednesdays, Saturdays, and Sundays. And I'm not sure when I'm going to do another circular staircase bonus stream. Probably not next week. I don't know. It just depends on how much I have going on after, in real life, and how busy work is, and what time I get home from work. And days when I take the bus, I get home kind of late. But yeah, I was just telling everybody kind of the upcoming schedule before we raid out. On Wednesday, I'll be playing Leather Goddesses of Phobos, a rather sexual text adventure from 1986. It's also comic and sci-fi and not very easy. And then Saturday, I'll be playing the short horror game Blackwell Asylum, which is not part of the Blackwell series, but figured I might as well play it anyway. And then Sunday, I'm going to start Blackwell. God, I always get the names confused. Deception. I think Blackwell Deception is the 4th game in the Blackwell series, which is an amazing point-and-click horror series. We've been enjoying it so much so far. And, yeah, next to last game in the series. Yeah, that's what's coming up. And know you like point-and-clicks too, Dom Retro. Yeah, there are some really good ones. They have some really great stories. Some of the most fun games
yes, I'm being followed by a Twitch viewer. Twitch viewer.
Oh, thank you so much for the follow, Dom Retro. Hey, welcome to the community. Good to have you here. Yeah, and then tomorrow I'll find out. Oh yeah, I mentioned earlier in the stream my debit card got compromised today, and so I had to cancel that and going to request a new one. Fortunately, whoever got access to my information only charged like $30 worth of groceries on it, and I'm sure I'll get that disputed. Mostly just an annoyance. But hey, at least I got rent paid for this coming month, so. Wonder how they managed to do that. Technology is a dangerous thing. Yeah, vile scammers. I'd like to know how they got a hold of it, so I can make sure they don't again. Okay, let me see. Who's still online? Obviously not Matt's game room. Yeah, I know Team Wildwood. They're getting smarter and smarter and more far-reaching. And they're skimming devices. See, we haven't raided. We've not raided in a while. Oh yeah, that's true. Matt's game room. Our friend Haggard Hessian is on. I feel like did we raid him not that long ago? How long has it been since we raided him? Oh, Dragon is streaming. He was here earlier. Yeah, you know. Maybe we should raid our friend. Oh, actually, I think also, is there anyone streaming something vaguely similar to what I was doing? Probably not. Actually, why don't we raid our friend Seraphines? Because he'd taken a bit of time off streaming, and it is his first stream back. So it'd be nice to show him some support. Oh, he's got a fair number of viewers, though. Maybe we should raid. Not a terrible problem to have when you have a fair number of people. Oh, okay. Or, you know, we could try and meet somebody new. I almost never do that. Popo and Duck. Yeah, we can meet somebody new tonight. And I do like retro. That seems to be half of what I stream. Depending on how one defines retro, I know it's a hotly debated topic. We're discussing that in RDM Havoc's channel today. Oh, The Lion King. I remember renting that from the video store when I was very young. Excellent movie. Kind of brutal game. Yeah. Yeah, cool to meet somebody new. But thank you, everybody, for coming to hang out. Whether you're chatting or lurking, I appreciate you being here. And especially hanging on these audiobook streams, which I never, how many people like these or how many people they attract. I think they might be more popular in the VODs. But, hey, you guys can find me on Twitter and MySpace, where I post stream announcements and random things, occasionally polls. And you can find me on... find VODs of my past streams on YouTube, where they will live in perpetuity. Oh, he likes hard games a lot, Matt's Game Room. Yeah, my pleasure, Wildwood, and Matt's Game Room. And thank you for the raid. And thank you for the follows tonight and everything else. And yeah, I'll let you guys know when I'm doing more of Circular Staircase. But I hope you have a good night. Say hi to Popo and Duck. And try not to have dreams about waking up and finding dead bodies that you've never seen before at the foot of your staircase. Though I dare say, that makes life exciting. Especially if you're an elderly spinster